Hello, this is Steve from ObjectRiver. Today we're going to show you a tutorial how to build a WebSocket application client and server. So two things you need is we're going to be using the IntelliJ's IDE, which is a Java IDE, and we're also using ObjectRiver's WebSocket toolkit. This is an open source toolkit that's totally free. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new project in IntelliJ. And what we're doing is we're opening a sample from the WebSocket toolkit. The sample is called Simple. So now what I've done is I've opened this simple application, and it's pretty much empty of source code. So first let me explain WebSockets and this toolkit we have. It's basically a B2B type client-server application framework, and what I mean by that is it's Java to Java. Now, before you stop this video because you can't send your JSON strings from your JavaScript client, let me explain what WebSocket is good for. It's basically a session stateful based system where your server has session state. You open a connection, you create a conversation of multiple methods, and if anything happens in the session, like it goes down, both client and server are notified with a message that the session is closed, etc. The second thing is it's totally bidirectional. So you can initiate a connection from client to server, and then you can turn that connection around, and the server becomes the client, and the client becomes the server. Also, it handles all binary data types. So you're not converting your data from strings to binary and back. So now let's start this demo. What we have here is an empty project, and we have what's called an interface definition language. Now this is a little different than what you're used to seeing because it contains methods that are described from client to server, and then a single method that defines the server calling the client. So here we have this application that's sending various data, enumerations, and beans. And then we have this one method saying hello, which is going to make a call from the server to the client. So right now what I'm going to do is I have ObjectRiver's Cloud Compiler plugin loaded, and I'm going to configure it to generate the source code. So here what I'm going to do, instead of a REST application, I'm going to say that this is a WebSockets application. It's Java-based client and server. Here we're going to give it the model. Needs an email address. So now I've defined the model to the Cloud Compiler, and I'm going to run the Cloud Compiler. What this is doing is it's contacting Amazon Web Services. That's where the compiler lives, and it's executing all the source code to create this application. I got to do a little cleanup. I got to go in and define the libraries we generated to IntelliJ. So we add those libraries. We also generated an Ant build file. I'm going to load that into IntelliJ here. One thing you need to do when you're building these Java applications is you need to build a WAR file. This is a file that contains all your Java code, and this is what you need to deploy your application to a web server. This is building the WAR file. So we just built this WAR file. And now we can look at our source code. It builds, it generates client and server source code. We generate a simple, we call the examples called simple, but we generate a server. This server runs directly in the IDE, so you can debug your application without having to worry about debugging it in a web server. So I can run this server. Okay, now the server is running locally in my browser. And I'm going to go find the client here, and I'm going to execute this client. So the client made method calls to the server. But what's interesting about this is the server made a method call back to the client. So highlighted in red here, this was a call from the server back to the client displayed on the console. So that shows like the bidirectional part of WebSockets. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this server. I'll close the client also. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Docker image of the server. Now what this is doing is Docker is a piece of technology that you can use to build these container managed components. And so our component is the server. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the server in a Docker container. And this is how you can easily deploy your servers to the internet in these containers. And so now I'm running this server in Docker. I'm going to bring up a console window. I'm going to say Docker images. And this is showing the simple web application. This is the image we made of our server. And down here, this is the image that it's built on. Alpine is a very small version of Linux and a Tomcat web server. If I say Docker PS, this is showing the running containers. And this is our server running in Docker. So now if I come back over here and I execute the client again, now the client has made all its calls, but now it's making the calls to a Docker container. And again, the same thing, the Docker container, the server, made a call back to the server to say, hello, YouTube. So that is basically how you take the ObjectRiver WebSocket examples and build them in IntelliJ and run them. So that's the end of our demo. Thank you.